Hello students, welcome to MOOC's lecture series. Today I will be discussing on a topic on Indian economy. The specific topic is trade policies of the government of India, its impact on globalization. Now, before starting and discussing trade policies, as a student of economics, one must know what is practically trade policies. Now let us look into what is trade policy. Now as a student of economics, everyone knows that foreign trade is a major component of aggregate demand in an open economy. And sometimes it is referred to as an engine of growth for a growing economy. Now, a nation's foreign trade policy basically comprises of the sets of rules, regulations, and the guidelines that governs the matter related to export and import or the foreign trade. And so, this foreign trade policy is also referred to as the commercial policies. Now, in case of India, the sets of rules, regulations, the guidelines are being published from time to time by the Director General of Foreign Trade. We call it DGFT, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. Now, since liberalization, the nomenclature has a bit changed. It is regarded as export-import or EXIM policy. This has been formulated on the basis of Foreign Trade Development and Regulation Act 1992, where the government has been empowered to formulate, to enact, to amend policies regarding the matters of foreign trade. With this brief introduction, let me move on to the evolution of foreign trade policy in India. Now, if we go deep into the literature on foreign trade, we can analyze India's foreign trade policy into 4 distinct phases. Number 1, phase 1, the post-independence phase, the policy of tighter controls. The period is 1950 to 1975. Number 2, phase 2, the new phase of ad hoc liberalization, 1976 to 1991. Number 3, the post-reform period, the first phase, that is the first phase of liberalization, 1992 to 2008, the pre-global crisis era. And number 4, the post-crisis period, that is 2009 till date. For the sake of simplicity, 1 and 2 can be clubbed together and termed as the pre-globalization phase. 3 and 4 can be clubbed together and termed as the post-globalization phase. Let us come to the pre-globalization phase. Let us start with phase 1. That is the post-independence phase, the policy of tighter controls. The period is 1950 to 1975. We start off with the opinion as given by Professor Srinivasan. He is of the opinion that India's foreign trade and exchange control regime before the economic reforms 1991 was selective, discretionary, and non-market oriented in character. Further, he was of the opinion that this foreign trade in India prior to 1991 did not play the role as an engine of growth. starting from 1947. However, the regulations of balance of payments became the central issue, and the government introduced explicit restrictions on foreign exchange. In 1954, India Tariff Second Amendment Act that led to the liberalization of import quotas, but it was reversed within a very short time in 1956-57 during the balance of payments crisis, and so import controls were restored. Now in 1966, an important policy shift occurred in the Indian economy. Rupee was devalued and measures were taken to liberalize import tariff, import licensing and export subsidies. During this period of time, the World Bank declared an annual grant in aid of $900 million package to boost imports. But unfortunately, India could not take advantage of this. That remained unutilized due to the crop failure in 1966-67. But what happened was liberalization measures were reversed in the early 1970s, and the trade regime became very repressive. The non-oil and non-cereal imports fell from 7% in 1957-58 to about 3% in 1975-76. By the end of 1970s, liberalization measures were sought to be restored, and that was done mainly because of two reasons. One, there was a trust from the producers. In fact, the domestic producers felt that the raw materials, machineries needs to be imported to produce exported goods, and they insisted on import liberalization. Not only that, there was sufficient accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. That took place mainly because of two reasons: the increased export earnings and the remittances from abroad. Now let us move into the next phase. The new phase of ad hoc liberalization, 1976 to 1991. The new era of liberalization was established with the implementation of the Open General License regime in 1976. Now, a commodity that enters this list qualifies for importation without any license from the government or the Ministry of Commerce. Now, these items also received enormous amount of concessions in the tariff rates, and they fell in the exempted category. Now, in case of capital goods, there are two types of category. One is the goods in the restricted list, another is the goods in the OGL list. In case of intermediate goods, there were three categories: banned category, restricted and limited permissible category, and the OGL category. Consumer goods fell in the banned category. By 1990s, what happened is there was a huge expansion of the OGL list items, and it covered almost 30% of the total imports from India. There was also a real depreciation of rupee by almost 30% during the period 1985 to 1990. It is also worth noting that during this period, 31 sectors were being exempted from import or industrial licensing. There was a steep hike of tariff rates across all goods, particularly capital goods. And one important change that took place during this period was the gradual shift from a quantitative restriction regime, that is a quota regime, to a price-based restriction system, that is the tariff regime. Now let us move into the phase of globalization. Now, we all know globalization is something which has affected not only India, but all countries in the world. And the impact of globalization was felt in various items, including the matters, the issues related to foreign trade. So, before trying to evaluate the impact of globalization on India's foreign trade, let us try to understand what is globalization. Brodo Taylor Williamson, NBER 2005, defines globalization as integration of countries in three markets. The markets are the commodity market, the labor market, and the capital markets. Professor Sunanda Sen identified four important aspects of globalization: worldwide integration of market for goods, technology, services, and finance. Number two, policies driven by market mechanism, and they were mainly skill and capital intensive. Number three, national policies were dominated by global movement of finance. And number four, growing inequalities within and among countries. India adopted liberalization, privatization, and globalization, that is the LPG policy, under the New Economic Policy 1991. We all know that India became a member of the WTO, the previously known institution, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. And under the WTO regime, where India became a member, India had to follow the commitments as a signatory of the WTO. Already unilateral economic reforms had been implemented since 1991. And as India became a member of WTO, changes in the multilateral trade disciplines under the WTO regime became prominent. The unilateral measures includes the matters related to exchange rate regime, the foreign investment regime, the external borrowings, the import licensing, import tariffs, and export subsidies. But India's trade policy is also governed by the WTO commitments, where trade-related investment measures, that is TRIMs, trade-related intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and also General Agreement on Trade and Services under the WTO tried to provide a level playing field for service exporters from abroad. Now let us move into the first phase of globalization. The first phase of globalization is the post-reform period 1992 to 2008. We call it the pre-global crisis era. Now, as we all know, this EXIM policy 1992 to 97 actually coincided with the New Economic Policy 1991. And the declaration was made particularly to promote exports, to restrict imports, and to improve the balance of payments. That was done mainly to pull out India from the crisis in the pre-liberalization period. And that was done mainly to encourage domestic industrialization process. In 1992, the RBI, that is the Reserve Bank of India, introduced the liberalized exchange rate management system, LERMS. The rule was to convert 40% of the current account receipts from the exports at the official rate and the remaining 60% at the market determined rate. Import licensing was almost abolished except for consumer goods, for machineries, for capital equipments, for manufactured intermediate products. There was complete abolition of import licensing. There was a massive reduction in the tariff rate also. And in particular, special import licenses, SILs, were introduced and continuously liberalized to boost the exporters in the agriculture, allied sectors, and services. Let us move into the next Exim policy, 97 to 2002. The items in the negative list were shortened while SIL import list expanded. But a little bit later, in March 2000, the Government of India announced to discontinue the SIL scheme from March 2001. Imports of capital goods were subject to concessional duties at 15% under the Export Promotion Capital Goods Scheme, we call it EPCG. A new duty entitlement passbook scheme, DEPB, was initiated, where the various duties that are paid by the exporters returns in the form of credit. One important change that took place during this period is the Government of India became inspired by the Chinese success on special economic zones, and proposal was taken to expand the export promotion zones EPZ throughout India and take advantage of the duty-free import facility and the domestic tariff area DTA. Items reserved in the small scale industries SSI would have no obligations to avail licenses, setting up units under SEZ. Let us move into the next Exim policy, 2002 to 2007. Offshore banking units, OBUs, were allowed to be permitted to set up units under SEZ. 20 agri-export zones were identified in order to promote export-based agro-products. In order to promote diversification in agriculture, transport subsidies were allowed, particularly in the export of fruits, vegetable, floriculture, poultry and dairy products, which are actually easily perishable. Under the Market Access Initiative MAI scheme, an amount of 5 crores has been allotted for promoting the exports from the cottage sector. Also, the handicapped sector were allowed to access these funds, and under the MAI scheme, duty-free imports of enlarged list of items under the handicraft sector were also given impetus in this policy. In order to face the zero duty regime under the Information Technology Agreement, the Electronic Hardware Technology Park EHTP scheme is being modified. Now let us move to the post-crisis period, that is 2009 till date. We all know that in 2008 the world economy experienced one of the largest shocks in the form of global economic crisis. All countries, irrespective of their status, both developed and developing, were affected in varying degrees depending upon their control, their supervision on foreign trade, exchange rate, and other domestic monetary and fiscal policies. Now, by the end of 2009, countries tried to revive from this position, and the Exim policy 2009 to 14 was announced particularly to arrest this decline and to revitalize those sectors which were hard hit by the crisis. Now, the measures that were being taken by the Government of India, particularly in the international trade, were the infrastructural development related to export promotion, the fiscal incentives in the form of concessions, levies, taxes, the changes in the institutional structures, the removal of unnecessary procedural delays, and the diversification of exports to regain new markets. These were the major initiatives that were taken in this new Exim policy 2009 to 14. Two more things are very important in this period. One is the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, we call it CEPA, with South Korea, and the Trade in Goods Agreement with ASEAN. And these are expected to provide a larger market for Indian products. The government also tried to boost Indian exports by brand India shows or made in India shows, at least 6 or more throughout the year and in many countries of the world. Now let us move into the Exim policy 2015 to 20. 5 different schemes under the merchandise trade were clubbed together, were merged together to form the Merchandise Export India Scheme, MEIS, and no conditionalities were attached to the scripts issued under this scheme. In the service sector, Served from India Scheme, SFIS, was replaced by the Service Exports from India Scheme, SEIS, that provides rewards to all service providers notified from India regardless of their constitution, their profile. And both this MEIS and SEIS could apply for setting up units under the SEZ. Duty credit scripts were freely transferable and usable for payments of custom duty, excise duty, and service tax. The latest in this series of modifications was made to facilitate foreign trade and ease of doing business by online filing applications and paperless trade in 24/7 environment. Moreover, the procedures were being simplified and digitization and e-governance were also introduced. Goods falling in the category of handloom products, books, periodicals, leather footwear, toys, customized garments, having the FOB free on board value 25,000 or more per consignment are eligible under the benefits under the FTP. Now let us come to the last and the newest foreign trade policy in India. That is during the period 21 to 26 with effect from April 1st, 2021. As we all know that this is an era of COVID-19 pandemic. Starting from the beginning of 2020, the world as a whole, including the Indian economy, experienced one of the most devastating shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is still continuing. And it started with a health shock, but gradually turned into an economic shock. And countries today all across the world are trying to recover from the crisis and adopting measures to actually revitalize or revive back to the pre-pandemic situation. One of the most important schemes related to this is the production-linked incentive PLI schemes, which was aimed to encourage domestic production, increase exports, and to generate more employment. Lastly, let us move into some figures which has been given by the WTO in case of both the world trade and in case of India. The initial prediction of WTO was that there was a decline in merchandise trade in April 2020 by almost 13 to 32%. Later on, it was revised in October 2020, and the revision was that trade would decline by 9.2% due to some easing of lockdowns and acceleration of economic activity. But finally, in 2021, there was an upsurge and economic trade increased by 7.2% in 2021. And these are according to the figures given by Economic Survey of India. Let us come to the Indian trade statistics. The latest in this series has been published by the press release Ministry of Commerce, Government of India, 13th May 2022. According to them, India is still maintaining a deficit in the merchandise and service exports combined, and the negative figures are 8.08 billion as compared to 6.86 billion in April 2021. If we look to the merchandise trade and service trade separately, we will see that in merchandise trade, the trade deficit is 20.11 billion, a negative growth of 31.50%. But in service trade, the trade surplus amounted to 12.03 billion, a positive growth of 42.61%. Let us finish the lecture with a positive note on India's potential in the world of pharmaceuticals. India enjoys a consistency and a long-run revealed comparative advantage, we call it RCA, in the pharmaceutical exports since 2009. India almost doubled its share in the world pharma exports from 1.4% in 2010 to 2.6% in 2019. And India's pharmaceutical industry is the third largest in the world after China and Italy. And in terms of value, it is the 14th largest in the world. India has occupied 11th position in terms of the share in the world pharma exports in 2019. Germany, Switzerland, and USA occupying the first three positions. Now, the reason for this is a significant raw material base and the availability of skilled workforce that has enabled India to emerge as an international manufacturing hub for generic medicines. And let us hope that India can achieve the $5 trillion economy which the government already announced in their policy. So let's hope that the foreign trade policy succeeds to make India and achieve a favorable balance of trade situation in near future. Thank you.